At long last, Nintendo have re-released a library of original Nintendo Game Boy and Game Boy Color titles, all beautifully emulated on their Switch and Switch-like consoles. It's a free download from the Nintendo eShop, however you will need a subscription to Nintendo Switch Online to access it, which can cost anything from £3.49 for 1 month to £59.99 per year, depending on your chosen package. Hi and welcome back to The Shed. I'm Joe Bleeps, and in this video I'll be checking out the newly added Game Boy library on the Nintendo Switch. The service launches with a selection of 9 Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, with more on the way. The software itself has got some great features, with one in particular that you are not going to want to miss. So it promises to provide a nostalgic kick of retro gaming on the go, but is it any good? Let's take a look. The software itself is presented like the NES and Super Nintendo library before it, as well as the Nintendo 64 and Mega Drive library that's available with the Expansion Pack Premium subscription. I've always been a bit underwhelmed with Nintendo's paid online subscription services. I don't really play multiplayer games online, so I've always felt like there's very little content for the money in comparison to something like PS Plus or Xbox's Game Pass. I appreciate it's cheaper, but still there's so much potential for a better experience. I was really excited when Nintendo 64 and Mega Drive content was announced. Finally, it was going to get better, and then I got annoyed again when I found out I'd have to pay extra for the privilege. So, having the Game Boy library added to the standard package is definitely a step in the right direction. As a piece of software, it's got some great features. You can play local or online multiplayer with friends, no need for a link cable or the multiple cartridges you needed on the original hardware. You can also have voice chat if you're playing online, but you'll need to use the Nintendo Switch Online smartphone app for that. There's a great selection of display options where you can get original games in a Game Boy, Game Boy Pocket or Game Boy Color palette, all of which are really authentic looking and faithful to the original displays. Now, of course, you can install modern IPS replacement screens into original Game Boy hardware. I'm a big fan of these. They're crisp, vibrant displays with options for lots of different palettes and settings. However, I've got to say the visual display on the Switch emulation really does, for better or worse, look much more like the original. The Game Boy display's got a classic murky greens and I love it, and although the Game Boy Color has a much more muted palette than the IPS displays, when you put it side by side with the original console, it's actually a very accurate representation. If you're interested in taking the modified Game Boy route, I have got plenty of tutorials on my channel. Go and check them out. You can, of course, just stick with the original, unmodified hardware for the ultimate nostalgia kick. As is often the case these days, all the options have their benefits, and we're just really lucky to have so much choice at our disposal. Back to the Switch, there's also the option to reproduce classic feel, which essentially overlays a pixel grid onto the graphics to make it look more like the original displays. It works quite well. Both the regular and classic displays look great. It's going to come down to personal preference which one you end up using. You can also choose the display with small screen option, which looks a little odd on the Switch Lite's display, but it does give a pixel perfect reproduction of the original Game Boy console screens, and it's well worth checking out if you're a purist or if you're just a bit curious. I thought there might be different wallpaper options for the bars at the side of the screen, but if there is, I haven't worked out how to enable them yet. If you know how to do it, or if it does exist at all, let me know in the comments. On my version of the software in the UK at least, there's the option to hide or display the European language versions of games in addition to the North American releases, largely for language reasons. So I chose, in my case, to hide them to keep the menu uncluttered. But if you're a French or German speaker, for example, then this would be an excellent feature of this software. By default, the main controls are displayed at the bottom of the screen, but they aren't very useful and they're quite distracting. Thankfully, it's easy to turn this off. Tapping ZL and ZR together brings up a suspend menu, where you can keep or load a save state of your progress on each game with 4 slots for each. The menu also allows you to reset your game or return to the main game selection menu. One of the most exciting features of the software that I'm surprised I haven't heard more about is the game rewind feature. If you press and hold ZL and ZR, it brings up a suspended screen that comes up with a load of stills from your recent progress. You can then scan back to the point you want to and resume your game without any of your fails. Is it cheating? Yes. Will it be immensely satisfying in those infuriating final stages of Super Mario Land 2? Also, yes. I love this feature. It makes a retro collection feel decidedly modern, and I got some nice Prince of Persia Sands of Time vibes when I was rewinding my gameplay. So, what about these games then? There's a regularly expanding library of Game Boy and Game Boy Color games with 9 titles playable from launch. Firstly, there's Alone in the Dark for Game Boy Color, which, I'll be honest, seems like a pretty random choice. However, there's also Game & Watch Gallery 3, Gargoyle's Quest, Kirby's Dream Land, The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening DX, Metroid 2 Return of Samus, Super Mario Land 2, 6 Golden Coins, Tetris of course, and Wario Land 3. And yes, you heard right, there's no Pokemon. Sorry, more on that in a bit. Game Boy Tetris is my all-time favourite Game Boy game. In fact, it's one of my all-time favourite games across any platform, so of course I've spent most of my time so far on that. The biggest difference from the original here is that there's a save state feature, so high scores can finally be saved. The original cartridge came along before Game Boy games had battery backup, so back in the day you just had to write down your high scores on paper for future reference, and you'd hope people would believe you when you told them. Now this is a pretty solid launch lineup, with Mario Land 2, Link's Awakening DX and Kirby's Dream Land, as well as Tetris, being the standouts for me. I absolutely adore Metroid games, but I could never really get into Metroid 2. The dark graphics on the original screen were really difficult to see, and I was forever getting lost with no map. Maybe with the save state feature, I might find it a bit more forgiving, and I'm looking forward to trying it out. Aside from Alone in the Dark, I already own all of these games on the original Game Boy cartridges, and although it's not like I'm going to suddenly part with them now that I've got them on my Switch, it's definitely nice to have the Switch versions there for convenience and what appears so far to be flawless emulation. There's nothing quite like blowing into a cartridge, whacking it into the back of your Game Boy and firing it up to those infamous boot logos and sounds. I know the games load quicker on Switch. In fact, I'll just take a moment to say I'm impressed with just how quickly those games load, pretty much instantly every time. But it's a shame we don't get those boot screens. It detracts a little from the retro experience of playing that Nintendo have clearly poured a lot of love into, and it feels odd having the games load without them. I think it'd be really nice to be able to toggle that boot screen feature on and off. Nintendo, are we listening? Okay, so having said all of that, when I later had closed the software to play something else and then reopened it later, I saw that the initial boot screen does this. So there you go. That helps a bit. Now, the other advantage of using the original hardware is, of course, the controls. I love the original Game Boy's big D-pad and smooth rounded buttons, but it's not really a deal breaker to be playing it on the Switch Lite. The D-pad and face buttons are fine, and you can use the analog stick if you prefer that method. There's also the option of using an external controller such as Nintendo's Pro Controller, or in this case, 8BitDo's excellent SN30 Pro, in the old school Game Boy Color scheme, no less. Playing with this is fantastic, and I think it's great that the 8BitDo controllers are so compatible and so easy to link with the Nintendo Switch, especially if your Joy-Cons suffer from drift, but that is an issue for another upcoming video. You might want to keep an eye out for that one. Anyway, that's a quick overview of what's on offer. More games are being added soon, with Zelda Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons both on the way, along with Pokemon Trading Card Game and Kirby's Tilt and Tumble, which should make great use of the Switch's accelerometer. That said, we all know what most people are going to be asking, and sadly, no, there's no Pokemon games on the service yet. It's worth noting that this service is being rolled out around the same time as Nintendo is shutting down the 3DS eShop. So, now that the option to buy and own these games legitimately is going away, it gives me a glimmer of hope that they might appear on here before too long. I think this is a welcome and overdue addition to the Nintendo Switch online service. Nintendo Switch, and in particular the Switch Lite, is Nintendo's current flagship handheld gaming single-screen console. It's like a spiritual successor to the original line of Game Boy consoles. It seems only right that a library of these original classics is now available on that new hardware. Now, I love to whinge about Nintendo, but in this case, I've got to hand it to them. I think they've done a fantastic job with this release, with genuinely useful features, excellent emulation, and a really clean interface. I love it. Now, if you subscribe to Nintendo's top tier package with the expansion pack, as well as Nintendo 64 and Mega Drive games, they've also added a library of Game Boy Advance games. And now I am sorely tempted to pick that up, even though it's not necessarily a bargain. So I might have a video about that coming up soon too. Let me know if you are interested. So thanks for watching. A big welcome to my new viewers, and to my classic viewers. If you enjoyed this, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, subscribe, sign up for notifications, share it on social media, let anybody know about it who you think might enjoy it. The more we can get this channel growing, the more I'll be able to do with it. While you're here, why not check out some of my other videos? There should be a couple popping up here that YouTube thinks you might like. I'm Joe Bleeps, signing off from the shed, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.